Whether you spent your teenage years blasting Black Flag while scribbling anarchy on your notebooks, or perfecting your sideswept bangs and eyeliner while scrawling My Chemical Romance lyrics on your Converse, which that latter one's definitely me. I didn't look like that, but I did listen to them all the time, constantly. Either way, chances are you flirted with either a punk or emo phase at some point. Or, as you probably told your parents, this isn't a phase, it's just who I am. For some, punk meant ripped denim, safety pins, studded belts, and a perpetual sneer. For others, emo meant long fringes, skinny jeans, band tees, and tear-streaked selfies. We laugh now at these caricatures, but for a generation of young misfits, especially before the modern age of the internet, those fashions were gateways to community and identity. The journey we're about to go on taps into those universal adolescent experiments and traces how two musical subcultures born of rebellion and introspection collided in Mexico City in 2008 in a burst of leather jackets, dyed bangs, police sirens, and probably a healthy dose of disdain for their parents. It shows how a tiny skirmish at a traffic roundabout became a national Rorschach test, revealing deeper anxieties about class, masculinity, identity, and the internet age. So hello everybody, today we're going to dive deep into the history of punk and emo, tracing their origins from 18th century insults and folk anthems all the way to Hot Topic aisles and MySpace pages. We'll compare lyrical messages and fashion, examine the generational fault lines that made one movement scorn the other, and follow the tensions as they spread. Ultimately, we'll stand with hundreds of teenagers at the Glorieta de Insurgentes in March of 2008. Watch as insults turned into belt swinging and witness how an unlikely group of Hare Krishnas diffuse the violence. This is a story about a fight between emos and punks, but it's also a story about what happens when two visions of rebellion, one outwardly political and one inwardly confessional, share the same city and decide the other's existence is an insult. It's also a story about growing up. Many of the teenagers involved are now adults with families, but feel nostalgic for their fringed hair. They recently gathered again 17 years later to commemorate the clash with banners reading, "This is not a phase, it's my true self." The moment made headlines, proving that, like any good song, some subcultures never really die. So if that sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about the punk emo war of Mexico City. As someone who recently got a house, I understand that saving money is rough. Everything's expensive nowadays, so setting a budget for anything is hard, especially when you have unwanted subscriptions that are dragging you down. Well, thankfully, today's sponsor, Rocket Money, is here to help. Rocket Money is the all-in-one personal finance app that allows you to set goals, manage your budgets, and handle your money better. Because not only does the app allow you to get a single view of all of your finances, but it also has a ton of tools to help you manage them. Tools like their subscription management. That consolidates all of your subscriptions into a single list, and if you see something you didn't want to pay for, with just a few taps, they can cancel your subscription. You can set budgets within the app and then get notifications to your phone based on your spending. You can also categorize goals that you want to save for, something like a house or a car, and also get tracking based on your spending categories, so where you're going over budget in some things and under budget in others. Because of that, the app automatically sees where you could save more money and even lets you set money to the side within the savings goal on Rocket Money. Earning money is hard enough, and saving it shouldn't be another headache. So let Rocket Money make the hard part easy. And right now, if you head to the link in the description at rocketmoney.com/Wendigang, you can get started on Rocket Money for free. That is right, for free. From there, you can unlock premium to get even more of the app's features, but for now, you can just try it out for free and see if it's right for you. Again, that's rocketmoney.com/Wendigang at the link in the description or the QR code to get started with Rocket Money today. Thank you to Rocket Money for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description. And we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. The word punk didn't start on a stage or in a garage. It was born out of insult. As early as the 1680s, English speakers used punk to describe rotten wood used as tinder. By the late 1800s, the term had morphed into an adjective synonymous with something inferior, and as a noun to label something worthless or a young petty criminal. Music journalist David Lang noted that the insult was often directed towards homeless and black homosexual convicts, people despised and marginalized by mainstream society. In other words, punk started as a term of contempt for society's outsiders. How fitting that those outsiders would one day reclaim it as a banner. When early rock musicians co-opted the slur, they leaned into its edge. They turned worthless into priceless and criminal into rebellious. At its philosophical core, the punk subculture sprang from anarchism, which, to make sure we're all on the same page, is, quote, a political philosophy and movement that seeks to abolish all institutions that perpetuate authority, coercion, or hierarchy. That aversion to hierarchy would shape everything from punk's lyrics to its DIY record labels. But before punk rock filled clubs, its spirit flickered in unlikely places: folk songs and fiddles. One of the movement's spiritual forefathers would be holding a battered acoustic guitar rather than a distorted electric. American folk singer Woody Guthrie, famous for his 1940 anti-establishment anthem, This Land Is Your Land, emblazoned a sticker across his guitar reading, "This machine kills fascists." His lyrics encompassed topics like the environment, love, sex, spirituality, family, and justice. Those songs would inspire later icons such as Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, Bruce Springsteen, and Peter Seeger, planting seeds of anti-establishmentarianism that would bloom into punk decades later. Guthrie's folksy brand of dissent proved that you didn't need an amplifier to challenge the establishment. If Guthrie proved the spirit, new technology provided the sound. The electric guitar, which debuted in the 1930s and 40s, fascinated jazzmen like Eddie Durham and Oscar Moore, country pickers such as Noel Boggs, and blues masters like T-Bone Walker and Muddy Waters. These pioneers experimented with the instrument's tonal possibilities, drawing other musicians and audiences to its new electric roar. By the 1950s, the electric guitar's volume and tone became the heartbeat of rock and roll. In the 1960s, garage rock emerged as a subgenre emphasizing passion and energy over technical skill. Bands with little formal training but immense raw energy, assembled in garages, played sloppy fuzzbox distorted guitar riffs and shouted their way into local bars. The sound was primal and full of attitude. Detroit area groups like the Stooges, featuring a young Iggy Pop, forged the link between garage rock and punk. In New York City, underground legends Patti Smith and the Cramps blurred the line further. By the 1970s, punk exploded in two hotspots: New York City and Britain. In the UK, bands like the Sex Pistols and The Clash channeled economic hardship and social unrest in provocative, politically charged lyrics. Their songs like Anarchy in the UK and the 1979 album London Calling offered anthems for a generation frustrated with monarchy austerity. Across the Atlantic, American punks responded with an aggressive, anti-establishment sound that would be called hardcore. One defining characteristic unified these disparate scenes: a do-it-yourself ethos. Punk bands released music on independent labels, bypassing corporate gatekeepers and fostering community among bands and fans. Of course, punk fractured into splinter groups almost immediately. Hardcore ramped up the tempos and aggression, with bands like Black Flag, Minor Threat, and Bad Brains pushing energy to new extremes. Post-punk and new wave took punk's experimental spirit in new directions, combining darker introspective themes with synthesizers and pop sensibilities. The list of notable punk bands reads like a history of rock itself: the Heartbreakers, the Talking Heads, Green Day, Nirvana, Sonic Youth, Blink-182, Weezer, Goldfinger, and more. By the early 2000s, punk had already influenced everything from fashion to politics. It prized authenticity and agitation, yet just as the scene matured, a new sound emerged that would borrow punk's chords but redirect its rage inward: emo. Emo didn't drop out of the sky with dramatic bangs and black eyeliner. It evolved from punk's own lineage. In the mid-1980s, a splinter group of hardcore bands began creating music that veered away from punk's political topics and leaned toward introspective matters like alienation, relationships, and abstinence from vice. They called this new style emocore, short for emotional hardcore. That's right, the term emo is just shorthand for the word emotion. The genre featured themes of teenage angst, love and isolation, and drew audiences through its confessional lyrical style. As emocore transitioned from underground clubs to mainstream radio in the early 2000s, bands like Dashboard Confessional, Fall Out Boy, and of course, My Chemical Romance blended those emotional themes with pop punk elements, achieving significant commercial success. I say of course not because I think they're super emo. I don't, as we'll talk about in a moment. I say of course because if I can mention them, it will happen. For fans, the appeal was the vulnerability. Emo lyrics adopted a male perspective on unobtainable love, teenage angst, and melodramatic breakdowns. Listeners often connected with this confessional style, in part because emo was one of the first subcultures to grow out of the internet. Bands used platforms like MySpace and Facebook to connect with favorite bands and with each other. For teens who felt like misfits, a social network offered a lifeline. The musicians later labeled as emo weren't trying to be different from their punk predecessors. Andrew Morrison of the band False Start admitted that he listened to mainstream punk rock when he first got into music and always considered his band pop punk. For the first year they were together, they had no idea the E word would be pinned on them. Quote, "We've always played the same style of music and dressed the same as we do now. We've only been labeled emo recently. Many emo bands admired punk. They just grew up in a different economic and social context and therefore wrote about different topics. Instead of railing against governments or monarchs, they explored personal trauma, heartbreak, and identity. That contrast would later set the stage for conflict." Similarly, Gerard Way, and I believe the members of My Chemical Romance as a whole, have talked about how they don't really consider their music emo, even though they're often labeled as one of the emo bands. And I certainly see why. There's a lot of their more popular songs that deal with the loss of a loved one or a breakup, songs like Helena or I Don't Love You. But understanding these songs in the greater context kind of take those emo roots away. For example, the Way brothers wrote the song Helena after the death of their grandmother. Although many apply it to a lost love, it's just a song about someone missing someone else who they can't be with now. This was especially apparent for the Ways, as they felt they could have spent more time with their grandmother had they not been busy trying to start the band. So rather than just a song about a heavy breakup or someone losing their teenage love, it's about the loss of life and the disparity between what you want while someone else is alive and what you'll remember about them or what you didn't do with them after they pass. Similarly, I Don't Love You sounds like it's just a song about a guy breaking up with a girl and being heartbroken that she doesn't love him anymore. But when viewed in the context of the concept album, The Black Parade, it's from the perspective of a man dying with cancer trying to convince a woman to walk away from him. That's why there's such vitriol in the lyrics. That's why he keeps talking about how she's obsessed with money and how she just wants to hurt him. It's not from a point of angst. He's trying to hurt her so she's not around for how this story ends. Now, obviously, the imagery from the music video as well as some of the lyrics play into the popular emo aesthetic of the time. And it's not like the band hates their emo fans or anything. It's just when you look at the breadth of their work that mostly deals with life and death or power ballads, emo's a weird title to put over their entire discography. Even if sometimes they certainly leaned into it, especially as they found so much success within that audience. And yeah, their first album, Bullets, certainly leans harder into the emo scene than their later music, because you have songs like Headfirst for Halos that talk about jumping headfirst for halos. But in my opinion, beyond the first album, it's weird to consider the band emo. I mean, how could you listen to Danger Days and call it even close? That has absolutely nothing to do with this video. I just only get so many chances to talk about them. Anyway, back on track. Music may define a subculture's sound, but clothing often defines its look and attitude. Punk fashion was designed to repel the mainstream. Ripped clothes, leather jackets, and DIY accessories became symbols of rebellion and self-expression. Band members and fans adorned themselves with safety pins, studs, and mohawks, projecting sharp corners as if to say, "Don't touch me." Punk embraced zines, independent publications, and nonconformity. Its style communicated a threat. If you're part of the establishment, stay away. Emo fashion took those raw elements and softened them. Dark clothing, leather jackets, and skinny jeans remained staples, but the aesthetic mixed influence from goth, indie rock, and even rockabilly. As a subculture movement based on irony hits its peak, fans started to wear vintage shirts, track jackets, and thick-rimmed glasses. Hair was dyed dark or neon and styled in asymmetrical fringes that covered one eye. Makeup wasn't gender-specific. Heavy eyeliner became universal. Retailers like H&M and Hot Topic quickly capitalized, marketing items to appeal to self-proclaimed emo kids. Both were theatrical in their own way, but one directed the gaze outward and the other inward. To better understand the ideological divide between punk and emo, let's compare two signature songs: God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols and Teenagers by My Chemical Romance. Oh yeah, Teenagers. Forgot about that one. Yeah, that's definitely emo. all that talk I had about, well, they're not really emo, but that one. Yeah, that one's in there. That being said, I remember hearing it for the first time in the 7th grade and thinking it was the coolest thing ever. I probably would have been normal had it not been for that. Both songs share a similar bass sonic profile, loud guitars and a rebellious energy, but they point their rage at different oppressors. The distinction between their targets reveals everything about the movements they represent. God Save the Queen was released during Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee in 1977. Its lyrics and cover were so controversial that both the BBC and the Independent Broadcasting Authority refused to play it. Despite the ban, the single reached number 1 on the NME charts and number 2 on the official UK singles chart. Conspiracy theories claimed the chart was rigged to prevent the song from topping the BBC's list. Designed by artist Jamie Reed, the cover featured a defaced image of the Queen and was later named the greatest record cover of all time by Q magazine. Britain's economy was struggling in the late 1970s, unemployment was rising, and public services were being cut. The Sex Pistols used the Silver Jubilee to highlight inequality and monarchy excess. They even tried to play the song from a boat on the Thames during the celebrations, only for their manager, Malcolm McLaren, to be arrested. The lyrics are unapologetic. God save the Queen, the fascist regime, it made you a moron, potential H-bomb. The oppressor is identifiable, the British monarchy, and the stakes are national. The band warns there is no future in England streaming. Do not let the monarchy or government tell you what to believe. By mocking the monarchy's own language with God Save the Queen, We Love Our Queen, the Sex Pistols turned a patriotic anthem into a rally cry for revolution. Now contrast that with MCR's Teenagers. Frontman Gerard Way wrote the song after being scared by a group of rowdy teens on a New York City subway. He wondered whether he had become the very kind of adult he resented as a kid. The song confronts the fear head on. The chorus declares that all teenagers scare the living shit out of me. And the verses describe adults trying to control you through lies, medication, and violence. Unlike God Save the Queen, where the oppressor is the monarchy, the oppressor in Teenagers is more nebulous. Adults as a demographic, including the singer himself. The song acknowledges the hypocrisy. The author hates an oppressive system in which he himself is a participant. The stakes are the dreams and autonomy of the next generation. The call to action is not to overthrow a monarch, but to validate teenage angst and encourage listeners to be themselves. It's an anthem for misfits, but its change is personal rather than political. This inward focus means emo culture often lacked a clear direction for its anger. While the Sex Pistols aimed their rage at an identifiable institution and sought structural change, in at least this example, MCR vented against an amorphous demographic and expressed internal turmoil. As mentioned earlier, regardless if this was the band's intention or not, this is what the audience got out of it. As a result, emo's anger could at times feel directionless, while critics argued such introspection fostered negative, harmful behaviors like self-harm and suicide, or in some cases, the harming of others. In Teenagers, the last verse ends with the line, "What you've got under your shirt will make them pay for the things that they did." With lyrics focused on mental and emotional anguish, some believe the genre was romanticizing self-destruction. A 2012 study of international Facebook groups found that self-harm was frequently discussed and portrayed positively within emo forums. Emo proponents countered that self-harm wasn't unique to their subculture. Which is true, it's not like emos invented the idea of it, but there's certainly times where, the topic comes up. It's also interesting because if I recall right, Teenagers like Helena were two songs that weren't written for the concept of the album that was being written at the time, so Three Cheers and The Black Parade. They're just both things that sonically sounded right within the album, so the band put them in. And it's interesting that those are two of the songs that are most often associated within the emo scene. Ironically, as I said earlier, MCR rejected the very idea that they were an emo band. Gerard Way bristled when asked about it in mid-2007, calling emo, quote, garbage, and insisting that no one actually listening to My Chemical Romance's records would find similarities with so-called emo bands. Okay, well, I didn't know he said that specifically. That's a bit more intense than what I implied earlier, that he was mostly chill with it. From interviews, I've seen him be chill with it in later years, but initially that seems to not be the vibe he had. The Rolling Stone article capturing his rant implied he was referring to Fall Out Boy, whose bassist Pete Wentz found the label much less objectionable. When asked, Wentz joked about playing in front of a giant banner that said emo and hoped that some bands could grow beyond the label. Thus, even within the scene, there was tension over what emo meant and whether or not it was derogatory. Emo may have blossomed under the influence of American bands, but subcultures rarely stay confined to their countries of origin. By the mid-2000s, emo had spread across the world, including Mexico. Bands like MCR, Paramore, and Fall Out Boy gained fans alongside Latin American acts like PXNDX, also known as Panda, which, looking at that word now, yeah, that's definitely Panda and not Pux and Dux. Acts like Panda, Deluxe, and Kudai. As the movement grew, emos were no longer isolated clusters of friends. Places like malls, parks, and public plazas across Mexican cities filled with teenagers sporting long bangs and dark clothing. The sudden visibility of this new tribe could not be ignored, especially by punks who saw themselves as original, rebellious subculture. Punks often perceived emo as a poor imitation of their own ethos. Radio Ambulante reported that punks thought emos were, quote, an attempt to copy something from everyone and get nothing of their own. As soon as emos arrived, punks harassed them and pushed them away. As one punk declared, quote, that is not a movement. That is not culture. You talk to me about culture. I'm a Mexica. Another sneered, quote, they take depression as their main ideology. And depression is not an ideology. It's an illness. Getting pretty heated. Some of the verbiage getting thrown back and forward. Punk musicians built their scene around political anger and lived experiences. Seeing younger kids adopt a derivative style of clothing and emotions without the same socioeconomic struggle almost felt like a threat to their legacy. As tensions shimmered in plazas and markets, mainstream media amplified them. On the Mexican music network Telehit, popular host Krzysztof Raczynski openly mocked emos on air. He joked that, quote, emo is for people who are just starting to grow pubic hair, that emos only liked bands because, quote, the lead singer is cute, and questioned why a new genre was necessary to express emotions when, quote, death metal already existed. Krzysztof's commentary went viral. His tough, no-nonsense image resonated with some rockers who felt annoyed by emotional teenagers. However, this ridicule had real consequences. Around the time Krzysztof spoke out, Mexico City's emo community had coalesced around the Glorieta de Insurgentes, a large roundabout with a nearby bar. Many emos didn't even go inside. They just hung out in the plaza, listening to music and bonding. Having a physical gathering place provided a sense of belonging for adolescents who often felt like outsiders. But it also made them highly visible targets. Punks and other anti-emos soon infiltrated these hangouts, beating emo kids and cutting off their signature bangs, which I can only imagine is like in the James Cameron Avatar movies when you cut off their hair and it kills them. I can only imagine the same thing happens to a 15-year-old kid who only looks out of his left eye. Videos of the attack circulated online. MySpace and email chains spread images with slogans like be a patriot, kill an emo. All right, well, that's a few steps past where we are right now. I think maybe be a patriot, yell at an emo, potentially even mock an emo. I feel like kills jumping the gun a bit. Even Krzysztof, whose jokes had fueled some of this outrage, went back on Telehit and urged viewers to leave emos alone. He pointed out that punks were picking on kids who wouldn't fight back and declared, quote, I may not agree with what emos think, but I would die to defend the rights that those bastards have to express themselves. Fortunately, as you can probably tell from the title of this video, the apology came too late. The violence reached a boiling point on Saturday, March 15th, 2008. Online groups circulated a message calling for a beating at the Glorieta de Insurgentes. This was to take place at 3 p.m. The emos knew about it, but rather than staying home, more than the usual number showed up. A lot more than the usual number. A full-on army of emos showed up in force, determined not to be intimidated. In the bar near the plaza, some felt tense, unable to ignore the coming atmosphere. Punks could arrive at any moment. Imagine West Side Story, but with ripped jeans and metal stud belts. If the call to arms felt sudden, it was because it traveled through every social network the emos had. Weeks before the battle, flyers circulated MySpace, High Five, Metroflog, and MSN Messenger, calling on emos to assemble. So it's like the Avengers, but with eyeliner. Newspapers that later reported on the war would later disagree about the exact number of soldiers on either side of the battlefield. Some papers claimed 300 to 500 emos faced roughly 200 punks. Regardless of the number of people who were there, what mattered to the kids in the trenches of the roundabout that day was that, for the first time, their online world spilled onto the street. They arrived in waves, carrying homemade signs and wearing their finest sideswept bangs. Soon, around 20 anti-emos approached the group. Even though they were vastly outnumbered, they began shouting threats. Quote, "I'm gonna beat you up. I'm gonna kill you. Now you'll see, mother." The emos responded with defiance, saying "Kamara," a slang way of telling someone to go ahead, daring them to do something. The police tried to impose peace with their presence, but at this point, no one cared and the conflict kept escalating. Emos began defending themselves by throwing trash, and the punks replied with blows. Despite stereotypes of emo kids as, sensitive and passive and kids afraid of their own shadow, these kids fought back hard. Yet much of the battle consisted of chants and curses. Emos chanted, "Emos, emos, emos," while punks responded with slurs that might be described as a bit anti-gay. You know the one I'm talking about. So you have one side chanting emos and the others chanting that. Imagine just like a family out on a stroll and then they just walk by this scene. You walk away, right? Like I would say in most cases, I'd want to stick around and see how it turns out. But if there's this many people, you have to assume this is some like flash mob or something is about to explode. This anti-gay sentiment was an undercurrent present throughout the entire conflict. Journalist Gustavo Arellano noted that the sexual ambiguities cultivated by emo fashion, like men wearing eyeliner and tight jeans, made them targets in a machismo culture. A former emo recalled that their attackers were mostly young men in their 20s beating up adolescents aged 13 to 17, often mocking them with insults about their perceived sexuality and masculinity. Now, were these insults meant specifically and tactically for the purpose of addressing the emo's real sexual identity, or were these merely the standard insults of the time? Probably a little bit of both, but as someone who grew up on Xbox Live Chat in the early 2010s, it was probably a lot of the latter too. I don't think when I killed all those guys with a javelin missile on Rust in Modern Warfare 2 that they actually mistook me for being homosexual, but they called me that anyway. Witnesses recall water bottles sailing through the air and belts whipping across bare skin. Emo kids unsnapped their spike belts and swung them like medieval flails. Punks escalated from throwing water bottles to throwing glass bottles, some of which struck police officers. Which, yes, the police did show up, but there was not nearly enough of them. Metalheads that arrived later chased the emos around the plaza, while the emos retaliated by dragging the punks to the ground. The result looked less like a staged rumble and more like a chaotic mosh pit. You do have to ask yourself what kind of music was playing, right? Like, surely to God, someone had a boombox. Just whatever you think's the funniest thing to play at that time, that's what was happening. After an hour of yelling and throwing blows, both sides needed air. They retreated to opposite sides of the plaza, attending to their wounded. I love the wording in this, like it's a World War I trench battle. The police tried to use the break to disperse the groups. Suddenly, people started taking off their belts again to use them as whips. A sign that they weren't done and they didn't hear no bell. I do appreciate that both sides had an agreed upon break to get water and refreshments before they continued fighting. Even the women on both sides joined in. As one account notes, they quote, transformed into beasts. Just a very scared man witnessing this, and he's like, the women. They became monsters. As the melee grew, authorities struggled to separate the crowds. Someone put the stupid picture of that wolf tearing open its shirt. Wave 2 of the battle had begun. The punks used the downtime to call in reinforcements, and soon the number of combatants swelled as more punks joined the fight. The second clash of the emo and punk titans was wider and more indiscriminate. The fight had degenerated into everyone against everyone. More than 100 police officers and riot squads rushed to the plaza, forming barriers and evacuating bystanders. Still, they couldn't fully control the crowd. They couldn't hold back the beast within the emos and the punks. Shoppers at the nearby mall watched in disbelief as more belts cracked against each other like leather swords, and teens were tackling each other to the ground. The war lasted for hours. Despite the broken glass and the ripped band tees, there were no serious injuries, even though some of those band tees could go for pretty good money on eBay now. Police officers who were interviewed after the event admitted they didn't even know what the conflict was about, as I'm sure most normal people didn't that day. At the height of the chaos, something unexpected happened. A group of Hare Krishnas, men wearing orange and white robes, carrying drums and cymbals, marched through the square for their weekly Saturday performance. They waved and smiled at the aggravated youths. Miraculously, within an hour of their arrival, the crowd began to disperse. One attendee recounted that the Krishna's presence, quote, kind of got us out of the mood. This is like a Family Guy bit. Like, they were so mad at each other, they came back for round 2. And everyone started fine, and the group of, like, monks with instruments just walk in the middle. And everyone's like, oh, I don't want to fight. I don't want to, like, throw glass bottles at people anymore. That's the best argument for Hare Krishnas I've ever heard. Their presence literally causes peace in the midst of this, like, multi-layered war. Decades of pin-up cultural tension dissolved not through police batons, but unexpected spiritual chanting. There were no serious injuries, but the news cameras had captured the brawl. Stories of the emo versus punk war spread rapidly, often with little understanding of the subcultures and backgrounds that led to the clash. The media's sloppy framing of the fight only deepened confusion. Some outlets reported that the conflict was between emos and goths, conflating the two alternative cultures. This misrepresentation demonized goths and made emo kids fear them, creating new rifts. In truth, many goths sympathized with emos. They themselves were no strangers to discrimination. Local goths hung out at the El Chopo, a music-focused flea market in Mexico City. When they heard about the brawl at the Glorieta, they felt compelled to act. A gothic subculture activist, Darren Cana Marine, said, quote, how is it possible that we consider ourselves empathetic people if we also suffer discrimination and attacking other people for something as absurd as how they dress? Another goth, Angelica Gonzalez, criticized the punks who beat emos. The old punks fought against oppression. They didn't get together to beat children. Quote, why would you go around fighting because of what they wear or don't wear? It's all bullshit, she said. 1 week after the Glorieta fight, a coalition of goths, punks, darks,
the sportos, motorheads, geeks, sluts, bloods, wastoids, dweebies, dickheads,
and metalheads marched to the emo hangout to support them. 50 black-clad individuals with studs, spikes, extravagant hairstyles, and boots boarded a subway car together. Their presence was so intimidating that police officers let them ride for free. They carried an improvised white flag made from a t-shirt on an umbrella to signal they came in peace. Still, some emos panicked when they saw the black-clad group approaching. The goths explained that not all punks and darks wanted to attack them. Many supported them and wanted to help. The gathering transformed into a kind of political rally for urban groups. Goths addressed journalists, quote, we want to talk so that you realize we are never going to attack you physically or verbally. We punks, darks, and metalheads won't have television stations slandering us and saying we are aggressors. They also organized a public march to defend themselves peacefully, promising to guard the Glorieta to watch for violent punks. Government officials even facilitated an improvised dialogue between emos, punks, activists, and authorities to broker peace. Yet the media still got it wrong. Reporters proclaimed, quote, finally, the goths and the emos have made peace, frustrating the goths who have been defending emos all along. You know, maybe they did have a point when they said that nobody understood them. I will also point out how much the details of this read like a skirmish between two obscure smaller nations, but it's just people standing around Mexico City listening to pretty similar but slightly different music. dressing in pretty similar but slightly different ways. The most tangible response to the violence came 2 weeks later. On March 29th, 2008, a march titled "Respect for Diversity, Not to Discrimination Against Youth" took place. It was a warm, beautiful day. Several emos, some accompanied by parents, carried posters and chanted slogans. The march began at the Glorieta and ended at the El Chopo. Police officers, around 230 of them, guarded the route. At the entrance to El Chopo, organizers unfurled a hastily painted canvas reading, "Welcome to El Chopo, emos," and El Chopo is for culture and tolerance. The word hastily there is so funny. Like the owners of the place saw the crowd coming over the hillside and they're like, and they rip a tablecloth off a table and like scratch the words in real quick. Fortunately, anti-emos stationed near the entrance jeered and mocked the marchers, so the event had to end early to maintain peace. Still, the demonstration sent a message. The participants weren't asking for domination, but for coexistence. It's funny how now these exact same emotions could all be carried out in a series of Twitter replies. After the march, media reactions were mixed. A Vice article by Mauricio Garcia expressed dismay at the formation of emo punk tolerance committees. He mocked Telehit for hosting roundtables on emo-ness and found it absurd that kids who flat iron their hair were at press conferences talking about discrimination and justice. Older commentators trivialized the struggle of emo teens, painting their political awakening as shallow. Telehit, on the other hand, recognized its role and invited emo kids to speak, using the controversy to give them a platform. Conflicts didn't vanish overnight. Anti-emo violence continued in some regions, enough that the Mexican Human Rights Committee launched an investigation to identify those who organized the attacks online. Over time, though, the issue faded. Mostly because people grew up. The emo community's numbers dwindled as teenagers moved on to college, started families, or found other communities. If the Mexico City brawl seemed absurd, the global backlash against emo proved far more deadly. In 2012, human rights activists reported that Iraq's moral police had stoned to death at least 90 teenagers for having emo appearances. Leaflets warned young people not to adopt the style, and the Iraqi Interior Ministry declared the emo phenomenon a form of devil worship that needs to be eliminated. Officials complained that these youths wore tight clothes adorned with skulls, rings on their noses and tongues, and they carried skull-shaped stationery. So the natural response is to kill them. Can't be having tight clothes, can we? According to activists, armed men dressed in civilian clothes led teens to secluded areas, stoned them to death, and then dumped their bodies in garbage dumpsters. Killings targeted any teenager with Western-style hair or clothing and were often conflated with homosexuality. Quote, "I have long hair, but that doesn't mean I'm an emo," one young Iraqi man told reporters. "I'm not less of a man if I have long hair. This is me." The Iraqi crackdown illustrates the lethal potential of moral policing. Where Mexico's punks swung belts, Iraq's militias hurled stones. It reminds us that authoritarian control of youth culture is not exclusive to one nation. When nonconformity is framed as an existential threat, even a haircut can be a death sentence. The emo punk skirmishes in Mexico echoed older clashes between youth subcultures. The magazine Wired noted that observers saw parallels to the Hells Angels beating hippies at the 1969 Altamont Music Festival and to Britain's Mods versus Rockers battles. In the early 1960s, British youth split into two stylish camps: leather-clad rockers who worshipped 1950s rock and roll, and scooter-riding mods obsessed with jazz, soul, and sharp tailoring. Their rivalry escalated into brawls at seaside resorts such as Margate, Brighton, and Clacton during the Easter and Whitsun holidays of 1964. News coverage labeled the youths as vermin and louts, sparking a moral panic about juvenile delinquency. Heavy fines and sensational headlines followed, and the sociologist Stanley Cohen would later use these events to coin the term moral panic, illustrating how media amplify youth clashes into existential threats to society. What all this tells me is that we, as a society, quite often freak out and fight over what is, at the end of the day, the dumbest things you could imagine. I mean, these guys are literally so mad about the music someone else is listening to, they are having a fist fight next to cops. Another infamous case unfolded 5 years later at the Altamont Free Concert. Seeking to recreate the utopian spirit of Woodstock, the Rolling Stones staged a free festival in Northern California on December 6, 1969. Unlike Woodstock, however, Altamont was hastily organized. Security was outsourced to members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club in exchange for $500 worth of beer. That sounds like an incredible story that I'm sure I'll get to one day. The festival descended into chaos, as you can imagine, with a bunch of drunk Hells Angel members as your security. During the Stones set, 21-year-old Hells Angels Alan Pissarro stabbed 18-year-old Meredith Hunter to death just feet from the stage, while Jefferson Airplane singer Marty Ballin was knocked unconscious, and Crosby, Stills and Nash's Stephen Stills was jabbed with a bicycle spoke. The Stones continued playing, unaware of the murder right in front of them. Altamont has since been remembered as a dark bookend to the 1960s counterculture, showing how utopian gatherings can turn deadly when alpha subculture mixes with intoxication and poor planning. And also, getting a gang known for murder really drunk as payment. When Mexican punks invoked the Hells Angels, or Mods versus Rockers, they were drawing on a long history of youth movements colliding violently, sometimes with tragic outcomes. Let's also keep in mind that what was really happening in the midst of a lot of this was older punks didn't like how some of the emo kids dressed, so they went to a public place and beat up what was most likely a group of people with the average age of like 15 or 16. They just beat the crap out of them, and it's much less of a battle and more just people beating up children. On March 15th, 2025, exactly 17 years after the 2008 brawl, a group of former emo kids and sympathizers held a commemorative march in Mexico City. They carried banners declaring, quote, "This is not a phase, it's my true self." Dozens of participants returned to the Glorieta de Insurgentes to stage a peaceful mock fight, mimicking the 2008 skirmish in good fun. The event wasn't about reigniting old hostilities, but celebrating a shared identity and perhaps laughing at the absurdity of it all. As one emo leader said back in 2008, quote, "We do not have the right. We have an obligation to be ourselves and defend what we want." The 2025 march embraced that ethos for a new generation. So it was basically like a Civil War reenactment, but with grown adults dressed as the emos they were 17 years ago. It's also really funny to imagine all these people who got beat up when they were like 14 years old now showing up with their families and like kids in strollers and marching around with mascara and hair over their eye. One recurrent tension throughout history is authenticity versus appropriation. Punks in Mexico accused emo kids of copying their look without understanding the culture's roots. Them, emo was a fashion trend devoid of history. Yet the emo movement evolved from punk. It simply directed its gaze inward rather than outward.
All right, think of it this way. A goth believes that deep down the world is totally f***ed up. But an emo thinks that deep down they are totally f***ed up.
That's not much of a difference.
The debate highlights how subcultures police their boundaries, sometimes gatekeeping newcomers to preserve meaning. Punk songs like God Save the Queen targeted monarchs and governments, inviting listeners to join collective political action, where emo songs like Teenagers explored personal fears and trauma. Both channel anger, but one aims at institutions and the other at the demons inside. The fight in Mexico City can be seen as the moment when these forms of rebellion collided. Punk saw emo introspection as apolitical or even selfish, while emos felt punks didn't understand their plan. In reality, both expressions have value. Politics cannot exist without individual stories, and personal healing often pulls from broader social critiques. The war showed people how different generations wield art to confront oppression. Emo fashion challenged traditional gender norms. Men wore eyeliner, tight jeans, and bangs covering one eye. In a counterculture that prioritizes masculinity, such androgyny provoked feelings of violence in some. Daniel Hernandez, writing about the emo wars for NPR, argued that emos were often associated with higher income backgrounds, which bred resentment in a country marked by stark class divides. Thus, beating up emos, to some, served as a release valve for economic frustration as much as a reaction to aesthetics. As teenagers aged, they moved on to new interests and responsibilities. But emo fashion never disappeared completely, and in fact appears to have returned with Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Stores like Hot Topic and Spencer's are still in business and thriving. Skinny jeans, dyed hair, and band teens are still in vogue for a certain subset of teens. The pop-punk revival of the early 2020s brought some of that aesthetic back into mainstream fashion and into the wired earpods of the modern teenager. For those who participated in the original movement, the memory of being ostracized for their clothes or music taste has in many ways been validated by the return of the trends that they once helped foster. The punk scene also evolved. Many punks in Mexico continued to champion things from indigenous rights to anti-authoritarian behavior. Some would later regret the violence against emos, realizing that beating children over haircuts does little to challenge the oppressive systems, and is also an insane thing to do regardless of what it does. Like, I don't care if beating them up over their haircut makes them change it. Don't beat up a kid. I feel like that's just a good baseline to work with. Stories about subcultures often get reduced to caricatures. The angry punks with safety pins, the depressed emos with eyeliner. The war between these groups in Mexico City could easily be dismissed as teenage melodrama, but as we've seen, it reflects deeper currents in society. How generations negotiate identity, how movements police their boundaries, and how marginalized youth become lightning rods for anxieties about masculinity and class. From the insult punk, which was once used to describe rotten wood, to the anti-establishment anthems of the Sex Pistols, from the confessional cries of My Chemical Romance to the MySpace pages connecting outcast teens and Fall Out Boy, from telehit jokes to Hare Krishnas, chanting, on both sides in every way you could imagine, or all sides, including the Hare Krishnas, this saga illustrates how art and identity collide in unpredictable ways. The 2008 battle at the Glorieta de Insurgentes lasted only a few hours, but its echoes lasted years. It led to everything from marches to human rights investigations. And 17 years later, the emo veterans returning to this plaza proved that the subcultures are truly living organisms. They grow, fracture, meld, and return in new forms. Punk's DIY fury and emo's confessional vulnerability both offered solace to young people searching for meaning. Their skirmish in Mexico City reveals what happens when those searches clash, and how empathy and dialogue, sometimes delivered by chanting monks, can heal wounds where fists cannot. I'll leave you with the immortal words of the great philosopher Jimmy Eat World. It just takes some time. Little girl, you're in the middle of the ride. Everything will be just fine. Everything will be all right. All right. That is the story of the punk emo war of Mexico City. I think this is a really interesting tale, and I think it's one worth talking about. Like, when you look at the grand scheme of things, yes, it's much lower stakes than some of the stories I cover. But I think the fact that it's so recent and people got so mad over this one super specific subcultural topic is enough to make it something worth passing on and worth talking about. And it's just something that I don't think could ever happen now. I mean, I was semi-joking when I said this kind of thing would just be on Twitter nowadays, but in a time when that wasn't as commonplace, when people didn't just fight on the internet, get their emotions out of the way, and then puff about it later, people would be in physical locations, and if you had beef, you had to go see them at the physical location. So sure, some fights would break out. They're just normally not, to this scale. But obviously, if you've stuck around this far into the video, you probably think it's worth remembering as well. And I think that's really cool, and we just want to say thank you for watching. As always, appreciate your guys' support on the channel. We're coming up to 900,000 subs soon, which means we'll be close to 1 million subs, and that will be really cool when it happens one day, I hope. As always, uploads over here, Mondays at noon. You can check out like 2 uploads a week over on Wendiglitch. I'm playing some of the Backrooms games over there if you're interested. Then obviously 1 to 2 uploads a month on the OG channel, Wendigoon. Speaking of Backrooms, I'll probably have a film analysis soon as I know A24 won't kill me for making it. Go see that movie, by the way, if you haven't. Kane knocked it out of the park. Everyone who made this video possible will be credited in the description, so be sure to show them some love. And all in all, I believe that should do it for now, but before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! Okay, I said all that stuff about MCR, but even if you think about some of the concept albums like 3 Cheers, it's about a guy who, like, his girl dies, so he makes a deal with the devil that he has to kill a bunch of people to get her back. And then the Black Parade's also about dying. And then, like, Bullets, you've got, like, headfirst for Halos and like Skylines and Turnstiles, which is about 9/11, which is a whole other thing. And like Honey, This Mirror isn't big enough for the two of us, which is like breakup. So, okay, I see the overlap and it's there, but at the same time, they're really good and it's special to me. So I don't care.